Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mark Sheelan. I'm Director of Programs here at the Middle East Institute. Welcome to today's event entitled Christians in Egypt, Strategies and Survival. We are delighted to host MEI scholar Andrea Rugh, who will talk about her recently released book. This work and several of Andrea's books are here in our holdings at the Oman Library at MEI. Andrea will start with some prepared remarks, and then we'll devote plenty of time to your questions. We are recording today's event for video and podcast, and with that in mind, I would ask you to silence your mobile devices. Before I ask Andrea to start her presentation, I want to encourage you to register for either or both of our events happening on Thursday, the day after tomorrow, at venues nearby. From 9:30 to 11, we have the honor to host Dr. Daoud Zatari, the mayor of the city of Hebron in Palestine. He will speak about the choking effects of the occupation and Israeli settlements on civic life and opportunity in his city and in the West Bank. That event will be at the Carnegie Endowment Building over on Massachusetts Avenue. Then from 12 noon to 1:30 on Thursday, we have an expert discussion on the allure of ISIS, featuring our newest resident scholar, Charles Lister. He will join Anne Speckhard, Ahmet Seytieda, and moderator Daniel Thurwer on a panel in the Rome building at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Andrea Rugh is an anthropologist and Middle East expert who draws on decades of professional and life experiences in the region. She has lived on the Arabian Peninsula, in the Gulf countries, and in Yemen, in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and in the country that is our focus today, Egypt. She did groundbreaking work on the effectiveness of educational aid programs, which resulted in her 2012 book, International Development in Practice, Education Assistance in Egypt, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Her newest release actually has its origins much further back, in Andrea's remarkable research on the conditions of the Coptic Christians living amidst Cairo's Muslim majority in the years under President Sadat. Today, with sectarian intolerance across the Middle East seemingly more open and more violent than in the recent past, the strategies for survival and solidarity that Andrea came to understand then take on renewed value. In that light, her release of this work many years later is to be very much applauded. We'll have a few copies of the book on sale after the event. Andrea will be happy to sign them, I believe. We have some works by other MEI-affiliated authors as well. With that, thank you again all for coming. Please welcome Andrea Rugh.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm understanding that having this event in the library means it's a cultural event, not a political event. So, and as an anthropologist, I really focus much more on the process rather than predictions about what will happen in the future or anything of that nature that's related to the Christians. I especially want to thank Amal, who's been a wonderful support ever since I've been working on any of these books. I just send her my questions, and less than 24 hours later, she's got the answers for them. So thanks, Amal. There were a number of questions that inspired this study, and there are a lot of questions more than this that one would like to ask about Christians in Egypt. But what I was looking at was how Christians in Egypt cope as a minority living among Muslims, whether at different levels of society, and what role religion plays in poor communities. Marxists, at one point, of course, you all know, claimed religion was the opiate of the masses, and if so, does religion make the poor passive? And to answer these questions, I was looking at Christians in two Egyptian settings. I looked historically at the relations between Coptic popes and Egyptian presidents since independence in 1952, and then locally by studying a community of lower class Christians in a mostly Muslim quarter of Cairo. From some of your names, I think you probably already know about Bulaq Abu Ela, which is a suburb of Cairo. I did the Bulaq study by accompanying a social worker for 5 years, literally almost every day, from 1976 to 1981, while she was overseeing the activities of a church-sponsored welfare center. In retrospect, those years under Sadat turned out to be one of the low points for Egyptian Christians. Today, I want to focus, I mean, you can read about the history pretty much, but today I want to focus on the Bulaq part of the story. But that I think perhaps some of you are not totally familiar with the history of Christianity in Egypt, so I'll give you first a brief overview. Christianity supposedly came to Egypt when St. Mark settled in Alexandria in the 1st century. And by the 4th century, it had spread throughout Egypt. And by the 5th, the Egyptian church had split from the rest of Christianity to become the Coptic church. Probably the worst blow to its interest came in the 7th century with the Islamic conquest of Egypt. At the time, the population was more than 90% Christian, and many welcomed the invaders, hoping they would expel the ruling Byzantines who persecuted the local Christians. Over time, however, many converted to Islam until by the 14th century, only about 10% were Christian. In the 16th century, the Ottomans conquered Egypt and established a government that essentially allowed communities of non-Muslims to govern themselves with separate legal codes and administrative systems. Christians paid a tax that entitled them to the services of the state, and that was supposed to guarantee their right to follow their own religion. Popes during this period acted as religious and communal leaders and relied on elite lay Christians to collect taxes. These lay tax collectors became more powerful than the Pope himself until in the mid-20th century, the balance of power shifted to church authorities. Vestiges of this Ottoman pattern can still be seen in the way sectarian groups tend to cluster in villages and city neighborhoods, and in the requirement that people still come under separate sets of personal status laws. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Christian differences with the Muslim community intensified as wave after wave of foreign missionaries came to spread the gospel. The Roman Catholics came during the French occupation, which was at the turn of the 19th century. The British Anglicans were there during British occupation, and later American missionaries from about 1854. All these groups found it easier to convert local Christians than Muslims whose practices discouraged them from leaving Islam. The British missionaries mostly left Egypt at the time of independence, while most of the Americans left after the 1967 war with Israel. By that time, Muslims had become deeply suspicious of missionary activity, and at independence imposed restrictions on their activities. Today, the official estimate for Egyptian Christians is about 10%, but the Coptic Church says more like 16%. And this is out of a total population of over 85 million. The overwhelming size of the Coptic Church, which represents 95% of Christians, has given it the lead role in negotiating with the government and speaking out on Christian issues. When I was preparing for this talk, I decided it was important. I could give you just academic details and facts, but I thought I should give you a sense of the people in the quarter of Bulaq, which despite its poverty is an intensely exciting place to spend time. Although just as grimy as other low-income quarters, Bulaq's old stone houses have a certain charm from the facade. It used to be one of the most fashionable neighborhoods in Cairo. The debris, though, has filled in the streets until it's a foot. When you walk into these buildings, you step down a foot or two because the debris has built up in these dirt tracks. basically only tracks between most of the houses in the area. And when the groundwater rises, even after the Nile was stopped, the residents always lay planks across concrete blocks to stay above the water level. Even after the Nile no longer flooded, there's periods of the year when the groundwater rises. The opposing rows of 3 or 4 story houses cast a very cooling and nice shade in summer, but a chilling dampness in winter. Long ago, the spaces between the spacious stone houses were filled in with buildings constructed of imperfectly kiln-dried brick, or more recently, cement block. Migration in the 50s and 60s inspired an additional layer of living space on rooftops in the forms of shacks banged together from tin ghee cans and other scavenged materials. By the 70s, when I was there, most Bulaq buildings had been subdivided into 1 or 2 room flats with a single toilet in the stairwell. To complete the picture of Bulaq, the washing hangs from clotheslines that are connected across these narrow streets and drips on the passengers below, passerbys below. Balconies and rooftops are piled high with broken furniture, old tires, and metal objects that might prove useful someday to the inhabitants. The goats, chickens, ducks, and geese share living space with the human owners on the rooftops, where it's harder for them to escape. On the orderly side, residents sweep paths directly in front of their doors every morning and throw out dishwater to settle the dust. Their small amounts of garbage fill empty lots until over the years the heaps reach the second floors in many places. Children pick through them for shreds of paper and collect them for their mothers' baking ovens. It's undeniably an orderly system if trash collection were available, which it is not. The garbage contributes to the characteristic smell of Bulaq that combines the odors of inadequate sanitation, mold, and age. I can still conjure up the smell in my own head. From morning till evening, Bulaq hums from the sounds of human and animals. But at night the shutters are drawn, with only an occasional light of a kerosene lamp escaping through the slats. Bulaq's a family quarter where men and women retire early after a day of work. Only the coffee shops stay open late, and the customers sipping their sweet tea or thick coffee, and smokers puffing dreamily at their shishas, the clack-clack of backgammon, and the sweet smell of hashish. Shops occupy the ground floors of residences in the main street, much as they did earlier when each section of the city of Cairo was self-sufficient. The stores meet immediate needs of residents with withered vegetables and fruit, staples such as tomatoes, beans, salt, onions, and garlic, and of course candies and cigarettes. There are also sweet shops and bread bakeries, tailors, carpenters, shoemakers, dyers, barbers, rug makers that recycle old rugs, old cloth, and secondhand furniture shops. In the 70s, children were entertained by an old woman who, for a few piastres, would make her dog perform tricks, or they rented bicycles or took turns on swings in an empty lot. On holidays, they saved their money to ride the carousel on the edge of Bulaq. And in spring, the wonderful, skilled Hully-Gully man performed magic in a nearby park, or an itinerant showman appeared with his portable 3D peep show. Daily vendors roamed the streets, hawking ready-made foods, kushari, chickpeas and lemon and salt, fried tamia, fresh fruits and vegetables, and kerosene for the housewives' cookers and lamps. Others fluffed mattresses, tinned cooking pots, sharpened knives, or took your goats to graze on the garbage. With his cry of rubia vecchia, a man collected and sold secondhand items. So life in Bulaq was never boring, and for children without adult responsibilities, it was always very exciting. On the edge of Bulaq, there are a lot of modern businesses, ironworks, welding shops, auto body workshops, mechanics, plumbers, electricians, and other skilled and small-scale shops that are family-owned. These so-called richer, the owners were the richer residents of Bulaq who owned these workshops. And they also owned the small shops in a nearby souk, or they dealt drugs, and some were quite wealthy. Despite their money, they remained labeled as lower class for a host of characteristics, including their limited educations. I can only give you just a brief image of some of the people I remember there. And they include a host of colorful personalities living in almost unimaginable conditions. There was the elderly old Kokab, who lived with her fair-haired granddaughter on a heap of rags under a staircase. Each morning she carefully attached a red bow to the little girl's hair before taking her off to school. There was Zainab living in a broken baking oven, who called me to share cracker bread sent by village relatives because she knew I liked it. There was Miriam, who was jailed for several years when her husband planted hashish on her so he could go off and with another woman. There was Daoud with a tennis ball-sized cancer in her breast, who had been turned away from the public Kasraleni hospital numerous times until we stood in line with her. There was the blind imam, whose marriage we arranged with a woman badly disfigured from a kerosene cooking stove. The water carrier, whose healthy son died overnight because she didn't have the money to take him to a doctor when he developed a fever. There was the runaway bride we convinced to go back to her husband, a Christian girl we saved from a Muslim marriage by finding an alternative. Saved, as in quotes. She felt saved. There was the Muslim neighbor who took care of her bedridden Christian neighbor for over a decade. There was Siti Nargis, the midwife who delivered the babies of Bulaq on plastic cement bags, and Sayyidah Antoinette, who performed miracles with her pictures of the Virgin Mary that wept holy oil. There was the seer who could tell you about your future, or which girl stole the money from the cash drawer at the center. These were just some of the memorable characters who lived in Bulaq, and I don't think I would be forgiven not to have given you at least a small picture of this. So many of the Christians in Bulaq came from Upper Egypt when Nasser's land reforms in the 60s forced them to find jobs in cities. The poorest settled in Muslim quarters where rents were low, yet near established middle and upper class Christian quarters. Bulaq is very close to a middle class quarter. In the 70s, Christians constituted 6% of Bulaq's residents. Many were immediately drawn to the Bulaq Center, where they could meet other Christians. The center, by then, had been taken over for some time by the Egyptian Episcopal Church after the British Anglicans left Egypt. Support came from the Episcopal Church, other affluent Egyptian Christians, and from Christians abroad. The Christian community in Bulaq was not what you could call a community in the usual sense of occupying a defined space with a recognized leadership. Rather, it was composed of people sharing religious beliefs and a feeling they were treated unfairly in comparison to Muslims. The main beneficiaries of the center were Copts, whose lives were affected by their economic vulnerability, their dispersion among the Muslims in the quarter, and their recent arrival from the south with their own more conservative values about how life should be organized. The staff and the board comprised Christians of other denominations and classes. The center's activities included literacy, sewing, income production, health, and religious programs. And although one might deduce their purposes, it was obvious that the forms of early British inspiration survived, but little of the original function. The babies were weighed in baby clinics, but for no discernible reason. Literacy was taught, but with little result. Two kinds of people participated in the programs. The Christians who when they maintained constant attendance at once-a-week religious services would receive small monthly amounts of money, holiday gifts, and regular visits from the social worker. The second group comprised Christians and Muslims who participated in the center's programs but received no additional benefits. The church's vision for the center was not immediately obvious either. The larger goal was clearly the survival of the Christian community in Egypt, and from observation, it could be assumed that the center's part was to stabilize this potentially disruptive Christian community, prevent conversions of local Christians to Islam, and promote harmonious relations between Muslims and Christians. Those in charge feared any disruptions might escalate and engulf Christians and Muslims in the wider region. The center proved most effective at providing a venue where these implicit aims could be accomplished. The key to achieving these goals was a very charismatic social worker, Madame Ansaf Aziz, who I dedicate my book to, whose job, besides running the center and connecting the members through home visits, was to translate the center's often vague moral messages into concrete behaviors people could emulate. Madame Ansaf, with her few resources, resolved minor health and economic crises, made marriage connections, and solved disputes between families. And more important, she modeled the correct behavior when any sign of unpleasantness arose between Muslims and Christians, using the standard rhetoric that we all get along and there are no problems between us. She was effective largely because of her sympathetic personality, but also because she transcended the class structures that normally patronize the poor. Her role suggests the importance of leadership and role models in a community of this kind. While national church leaders believed they articulated a moral vision for all Christians in Egypt, their words barely penetrated places like Bulaq, where people like Madame Ansaf gave a real-life quality to the moral messages. The book goes on to describe how the Bulaq Christians drew and maintained boundaries around their community, to know where and when and how they could safely interact with Muslims. First was the matter of identifying symbols in dress, names, language, rites, and practices by which people recognized one another as Christians or Muslims. In the most sensitive area of boundaries, such as marriage, Christian parents controlled their children's movements and choices of marriage partners. And if their efforts failed and the children married Muslims, Christians cut them off and patiently suffered the adverse effects on the entire family. There were also formal means that keep Christians and Muslims apart. For example, government rules against proselytizing constrained gatherings of the two groups. More important were separate codes of personal status law. These laws had different personal status implications that led to different family structures, greater tensions between spouses in Muslim families because of the ease of divorce, and between parents and children in Christian families because of they needed to control some of their behavior. Muslim marriage and apostasy rules drew converts into the Muslim community, while no divorce laws contained Christians within their communities. A potentially destabilizing influence in Bulaq, which I spend a lot of time in the book, was people's emotional and personal problems. The minor problems were often satisfied through chronic health complaints that elicited sympathy. But if problems became more serious, as in spirit possession, both communities had formal and informal outlets for placating or exorcising the disruptive spirits. These outlets were consistent with the different theologies and family tensions in Christian and Muslim families. In effect, at a personal level, Bulaq's lower classes saw religion as both a modest means of assessing goods and services and a way of conceiving their condition. Could one say that religion was the opiate of the masses? Perhaps yes, if religion was seen as helping them restructure reality in more palatable ways or accepting conditions they were unable to change. If what was meant was that they remained passive, then the answer was no. People were endlessly creative in seeking solutions to their problems, and religion simply gave a framework for explaining why me and why this result. So now let me talk a little bit about the relations between the Egyptian presidents and the Coptic popes. And I do it only from the period after independence, because of course there weren't presidents before that time. The Christian community had felt fairly secure under British occupation, and so they turned immediately to Egyptian presidents for support. What they wanted was for presidents to protect their interests, especially during sectarian violence, and to clamp down on the perpetrators of the violence, usually Muslim extremists. The first president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, formed warm relations with Pope Cyril, and when the Muslim Brotherhood attempted to assassinate Nasser, he harshly suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood. But Nasser's government also undercut many of the Christian advantages under British occupation. Nasser's land reform seriously disrupted the lives of Christian landlords in Upper Egypt and the Christian peasants who worked for them. After Nasser died, President Sadat at first cultivated good relations with Pope Shenouda and promised to protect Christians, but soon began encouraging conservative Islamic groups as a hedge against the leftists that remained after Soviet withdrawal. When Pope Shenouda complained about Sadat favoring Islamists and criticized his trip to Jerusalem, Sadat withdrew the Pope's credentials and sent him into exile. Several years later, after Sadat was assassinated, President Mubarak reinstated the Pope and clamped down on the Islamists that had assassinated Sadat. In return, the Pope tacitly agreed to support Mubarak and his government, and he continued to do so up until Mubarak resigned after the 2011 uprising. Pope Shenouda at the time went so far as to prohibit Copts from becoming involved in the Arab Spring protests that forced Mubarak's resignation. And while Coptic clerics generally obeyed, many of the disgruntled laity did not. By then, the Pope was old and infirm, and he died a year later. After the uprising, Mohammed Mursi of the Muslim Brotherhood Party became the first elected president and took actions aimed at establishing an Islamic state. This, of course, alarmed Christians, and some with means left the country. Enough Egyptians were dismayed by Morsi's action to support the coup of 2013 that was engineered by General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Although a devout Muslim himself, el-Sisi reassured Christians of his protection and clamped down hard on the Muslim Brotherhood as well as others. Consequently, in the 2014 elections, many Christians voted for el-Sisi. But as human rights abuses increased with no way of holding the government accountable, Christians began to have doubts about their own safety in el-Sisi's climate of repression. So this just very, very brief summary of Coptic popes' relations with the government shows that although most presidents started their tenures with reasonably good relations with the Christians and reassurances of their good intentions, ultimately their support dwindled when it became potentially expedient to take actions that harm the Christian community. Not always intentionally, but it was political actions that they felt required them to do it. So it left the Christians feeling vulnerable to the political whims of their presidents. So what were the options, strategies, you could call them, open to Christians to address their situation at both these levels, at Bulaq and at the national level? The options were neither good nor bad in themselves, but relied on context and timing for their effectiveness. Christians of different levels might see their needs differently and yet agree on ways of addressing them. The church leadership, for example, worried about conversions to Islam that diminished their authority, while Bulaq parents worried more about the consequences if their daughters married Muslims and converted. Yet both agreed that controls and sanctions were needed to prevent defections from the Christian community. There were three main ways that I talk about in the book where Christians managed this situation. By calibrating their visibility, by seeking protectors, and by creating exclusionary places where they could withdraw. The first, visibility, involved whether to reveal or conceal their identity as Christians, or in other words, whether to present themselves as a force to be reckoned with politically, or to avoid attracting the attention of others in the society. Either choice had certain implications. A group that wants to project an image of strength has to maintain its visibility by, at a minimum, preventing the defection of its members, and it had to protest real or perceived violations of its interests. If it wanted to maintain a low profile, its members had to stress common characteristics such as citizenship and keep religious identity personal and private. Visibility takes more effort, obviously, and takes more leadership than invisibility, but it also makes the community a more obvious target. In Bulaq, the Christians managed visibility by displaying or concealing markers of religious identity, such as those I mentioned earlier, names, but also tattoos, dress, jewelry, the way they speak. Most of these markers were easily concealed in casual encounters. As tensions increased in the late 1970s, the Christians started giving their children ambiguous names, started wearing standard lower class garb, the Galabia Basufra for those who know Egypt, and covered their tattoos and crosses with clothing. But their visibility as members in the center remained problematic. On one side, it showed their connection with powerful backers, against, on the other, revealing their Christian identity. Members seemed to accept these trade-offs for the benefits of attending. Also, the center softened its visibility through its charitable activities by preaching tolerance and by welcoming Muslims into most of its programs. But Christians during this time felt increasingly targeted by Muslims hoping to convert them. Visibility had repercussions at the national level too. In the late 1970s, as I mentioned, the Pope's public criticism of Sadat got him into trouble, and his years of forced exile were among the few times after independence when the Coptic leadership assumed such a low profile. When he was restored to his position, he had to play a less public role and compliantly support Mubarak's policies and candidates. And in many ways, this got him in trouble with the Coptic laity, some of the Coptic laity. Another example of the problems of visibility occurred after the uprising of 2011, when many lay Copts, along with evangelical Christians, joined Muslims in Tahrir Square. The positive response to these signs of tolerance encouraged the Christians to express their grievances more openly, and it's likely that this visibility led to retaliatory actions, such as attacks on the Maspero Youth Union and the Free Cops when they protested near the Cairo TV station in October 2011 that left 28 Christians dead. A final example occurred when the newly elected Pope Tawadros stood behind General el-Sisi as he announced the overthrow of President Morsi in 2013. Immediately afterwards, unknown elements destroyed Christian properties across Egypt. The popular explanation was that the destruction was revenge for the Pope's public support for el-Sisi, since it confirmed what many believed, that foreigners were behind the coup. A second option or strategy the Christians chose consistently was to seek protection, and I've talked quite a lot about that from these presidents. Obviously, the protection centered on presidents because of their concentrated power. But depending on the domestic climate, Christians also either stressed their connection to foreign churches, or when nationalist sentiment was strong, they emphasized their connection to the local scene by calling themselves Coptic evangelicals, Coptic Catholics, and so on, to suggest their local origins. The Coptic diaspora in the US at that time was increasingly supporting Egyptian Christians by financing radio and TV programs with Christian content. But while many were encouraged by this support, outsiders really had little ability to protect Christians inside Egypt. And often their support only aggravated the situation by lending credibility to claims of foreign interference. In short, in every case from Nasser through al-Sisi, presidents made promises to Christian officials that in the end they didn't keep. But what about Christians in Bulaq? What kind of protection did they seek? Since they only indirectly felt the impact of relations between church leaders and government officials. The protection they sought, as you might expect, was of a more intermediate or immediate kind by, for example, joining the Bulaq Center and seeking the help of Madam Ansaf, who represented powerful Christian supporters. But they also sought higher protection. They claimed, for example, that the appearance of the Virgin Mary at the Church of Zaytun in 1968 came at a time when the Islamic revival was getting underway, to show that Christianity was the true religion. For them, the ultimate protector was God, and they sought his intervention through the power of local practitioners in everyday miracles, in exorcisms, and in the church's holy symbols. They believed in the power of prayer, in the rewards of a moral life, and in acceptance of life's crises, as written, all conventional ways of attracting and deferring to divine protection. The third option for Christians was whether to actively engage Muslims on neutral grounds or withdraw into communities where they could better control their contacts with them. The withdrawal option worked by shoring up Christians' faith and their community boundaries against assaults from the outside. The danger was that it could marginalize the community even further. The converse, neutral engagement again meant emphasizing common identities such as citizenship, class, or location instead of religion, an approach contrary to what church officials appeared to want in consolidating the Christian community. The Bulaq Center was perhaps the epitome of this approach of withdrawal. It provided a safe place for Christians to gather and practice their religion. It established community norms and rewarded those who conformed while punishing those who didn't. It put obstacles in the way of conversion through arranged marriages, prohibitions against divorce, and sanctions that cut misbehaving people off from their families and communities. It made sure that correct messages were communicated through people like Madam Ansaf, or on a larger scale, the Pope endorsing miracles performed by the local practitioners. It urged containment of potentially disruptive conditions such as spirit possession within church-appointed institutions. And finally, it encouraged harmonious interactions between Christians and Muslims. The Bulaq Center invested substantial resources in maintaining this special kind of a bounded community, one porous enough to allow outside assistance in, but preventing bad behavior from escaping and affecting relations in the wider society. At the national level, as Islamists became more aggressive in the 70s and Sadat was quarreling with the Pope, withdrawal appeared an expedient strategy. When the Pope emerged in 1985 under Mubarak, he built on the existing interest in creating separate spaces in monasteries and other sites where Christians could retreat for stretches of time and revive their faith while enjoying comprehensive services. This walling off of Christians created a form of temporary, usually weekends and holidays, invisibility that reduced opportunities for clashes with Muslims. However, by isolating themselves, Christians again became more visible targets. Muslims looking from the outside saw only the ostentatious displays of wealth in the church buildings, retreats, and clerical life. And as one Muslim told me, they became suspicious of the activities that went on behind the walls. And there were many conspiracy theories that went on about that. So let me conclude by saying that we're left with a number of uncertainties. One unknown is the extent to which religious tolerance is possible in Egypt today, or whether intolerance will only grow. Many claim it was the youth of both faiths who prayed in Tahrir Square, the same youth who called for women's rights, human rights, and better wages for workers. But it was also youth who rebelled against their elders' moderation in radical Islamic groups and sparked random violence on the streets of Cairo. It's unclear which tendency will prevail. Will Egypt have to wait until the older generation is gone to achieve religious tolerance? Will suppressed groups like the Muslim Brotherhood grow more violent in the future, as many claim? And where will the Christians stand if either tendency prevails? Will church authorities ever accept equal citizenry and give up legal codes that divide the religious groups? Will Christian communities keep separation and withdrawal alive and continue to support political leaders and church authorities not always sympathetic to their interests? Seeds of all these possibilities, I think, are very much present in Egypt today. So that's, I hope I didn't talk too long. Okay. There were several other insights that came from this study, and if we run out of questions, these others are more general insights about religion and life and poverty and that sort of thing that I think contribute to some of the literature on the social literature on the Middle East today. But in the meantime, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Well, please thank Andrea for this. I'd like to.
I'm okay. Yeah.
I appreciated the attention you devoted in your remarks to these strategies of visibility versus invisibility and so forth. I have a question that relates to that, but I also want to bring out a point. Thank you also for the very evocative description of Bulaq. And I recall from the book that you, after you completed your research in '81, you visited nearly annually. Is that correct?
Yeah, every year I go.
And you made a decision, which you just explained somewhat in the book, at the time that you completed your study, not to publish. You remained in contact with the community. So would you talk a bit about your decision not to publish then and your decision not to publish now?
Okay. Well, I decided not to publish then because at that time it was an extremely sensitive thing to be talking about Christians and Muslims, even to be talking about poverty. Poverty was not something Egyptians were very willing to have publicly revealed. And really, basically, the lack of government services, the denial of the government of helping these poor. I mean, even when they were eligible for certain kinds of services, the government just didn't provide them for them. Anyway, so it was very sensitive at the time I finished, and by that time I knew this community very well, and especially Madame Ansaf. We had traveled all over Egypt together, and she had even come to the U.S. on a ticket I gave her, and she'd never been outside of Egypt, and I just loved her comments when she came to Logan Airport, and she said, who waters this all? She had realized she had lived in a place where there was the Nile, and that watered everything. And then she saw the greenery, and she was so surprised. So I was the anthropologist there, and I would ask her questions, and she would always say, we have to see it. I can't tell you about it. So she would arrange some kind of situation where I could see it. And when she got to the US, I said, now you're the anthropologist, and I'm the one you ask questions to. But she was kind of a remarkable person, and I got to know 250 families. I finally had records on them in this area, plus all the staff and various people that had been involved in the Bulaq Center. And I realized that she was going to have a lot of trouble if I published a book on all of this. And the story, the vignettes, the book is full of vignettes and the direct relationships with how she dealt with Muslims, how she dealt with Christians, how the way she sort of diffused some of the situations there, the importance of controlling marriage and all those things. And so I didn't want to hurt her or hurt that situation there. And so I preferred not to do it. But then I figured after Tahrir Square and all the Christians and Muslims were coming together there, and there was much more discussion about sectarian relations. And I thought maybe this is a safe time. And then Mena Mansaf died in 2013, 2 days before I arrived to see her on my annual visit. I was very upset, but by that time I wasn't able to hurt her, certainly, and many of the people had died who had been involved in this study. So that's why I'm publishing now.
Drawing on your framework of these strategic options, visibility versus invisibility, seeking protection versus going it alone, engagement versus withdrawal into cloistered communities. We see that in the newly elected parliament in Egypt, there are 24 Coptic Christians who are among the party list candidates that came in, and another dozen who won seats as independents running in their own names.
There's even a Coptic who's the head of one of the political parties, a woman Coptic.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit now, looking very much at the present day, how the calculations in these choices, these options, may differ between Copts or other Egyptian Christians who are economically advantaged and worldly versus the folks like you got to know best in Bulaq.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't pretend to know that much about what's going on now. I do talk to Christians when I go back, and there was a period of there was a negative period, but I would say right before the uprising. And for a while, there was a little bit of hope with the uprising that things would maybe stabilize. But then it went back into a feeling that they were kind of the last to have the advantages of any. And it might be partially their perception of the events. I'm not saying that it's the actual fact that occurred. I think a lot of people in Egypt now are feeling very diminished by what El-Sisi is doing, but that they're happy with the situation because it's stable and it's secure. And nobody at this point wants to start any more rebellions, although tomorrow, who knows, one can never protect these things. But of the different strategies, I think they're still out there. I think they've been going on for a long time, even in the period of, the ancient history, basically, of the Ottoman period. And there were people going into monasteries, withdrawing from the community. This was the option that a lot of people chose. So these are not necessarily new strategies or options for Christians. but it's part of their palette of reacting to the conditions on the ground. So I think each time, I mean, almost year by year, you have to assess the situation again. I don't want to make any predictions.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Andrea, please? We have a cluster of them. This gentleman here, please.
Wondering about the relations between Christian Coptics and non-Coptic Christians. Are they strong relations? Are they completely isolated communities, or is there some solidarity? And are the treatment by the Egyptian government, is it similar? Or the Copts?
I think the Copts dominate and they're the ones who are the major spokesmen, but some of the more active groups are the evangelical or Protestant groups. Well-known one is the Qasr al-Dubara Church, which is right in the center of Cairo, and they were some of the first to go out and be part of the protests. And it's been an interesting relationship because, of course, you would expect the Copts to be somewhat unhappy about the converts that the missionaries were able to make, and they got all of their converts basically from the Coptic Church. So there has been a strain between them. They also have different personal status, details of their personal status. Laws are slightly different. They have the Protestant churches, missionaries, did a lot with education and social services. And some people have said that that the turning of the Coptic Church to more of these social services was partly as modeling it on some of these other missionary churches that came in from the outside. But the Coptic Church, it feels very much an indigenous church, and there's always that kind of tension too between them, where you've got these other groups that originated from their theology, came from other places. But one of the things I look at in the book is the parallelisms. If you look at the Presbyterian Church as it was when it entered Egypt, and you look at it now in America, it's two different things. But if anything, the Protestant groups in Egypt, the Egyptian Protestant groups, they have days of fasting, it's almost as if they're trying to say, we're just as devout as all of you. We have all these certain prayers that have to be done during the day. It's almost, you can almost find parallels with not only other Christians, but with the Muslims as well. So if you have 7 prayers on this side, you have 5 prayers on this side. It's almost that they are keeping each other conservative in that way.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Obviously, with the work done in Bulaq, it's a fairly urban setting, and I was wondering if you could comment on the differences between urban and rural Christians and the strategies or other differences that you may have observed.
Well, that gives me a chance to give you one of the insights, which I think is interesting. A lot of the Bulaq people came from the south in the rural areas and migrated, or at least their parents did. Not so much anymore. It's kind of stabilized the area now. But what I found was one of the interesting things was that if you looked at the marriages of the people who came from the south, from Upper Egypt, there were many relative marriages, and it was in the traditional vein of always marrying a paternal relative, and that was the preferred marriage. When they came to Bulaq, the children, it began to be a preferred form of marriage to marry on the mother's side. And this was kind of an interesting thing to me. And My own explanation for it is that in the rural areas, of course, they're protecting property, and there's all kinds of traditions related to the paternal sides of the family. But in Bulaq, where you have very little property, women's services become a huge asset. So they begin marrying on the mother's side because this allows them to be in maternal households together and doing feast days together and helping each other in a less sensitive way. And the literature on the Middle East has always emphasized the paternal side in terms of marriages, but in Bulaq, it's really an asset. The maternal relations between women is much more of an asset. So it's true. I was looking at an urban area, but a large number of the people who were living in that area had spent some of their lifetime in the villages or were going back and forth to the villages all the time. And they all said, we came to the city to earn a living. And most of them said they didn't ever want to go back, although certainly to me, the quality of life looked a lot better in the rural area.
I should have asked questioners to identify yourselves. We have one more question, please.
Mike Alvin, an independent researcher. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. With regard to the hierarchy of the church, of the Coptic Orthodox Church, is there solidarity within the Coptic Vatican, as it were, or are there factions? And one hears about powerful laity or tendencies in the lay community, especially the influential lay community, that might run counter, at least to the old pope and perhaps to the new.
That's right. That's very true. And the laity was undercut by Shenouda. Once he came out of seclusion, he no longer was as obvious in the public arena. And so he set about consolidating his control within the church itself. And he got to the point where even the laity groups, he had to be involved with anything that any statements they made. He had to decide who would be on these laity committees. He also was co-opting clerics in his hierarchy, and so that they were mostly beholden to him. And it was one reason that when the Tahrir events started, the priests stayed pretty much, they did what he said, not getting involved. But since that time, and the laity is, along the way, the laity is often called for, look, we want to be Egyptians first and Christians second. A lot of them feel strongly that way. And the church is not so interested in that. They want to maintain the Christian community, and as long as you don't have civil alternatives to laws of personal status, you're never going to get that melding of the communities. You're never going to be able to be invisible, because you always have to write on your identity card which group you belong to. And I have yet to find a Christian, though, who says they want to have a civil alternative to the personal status laws. They almost always will say, yes, but if there's a civil alternative, it'll be based on Islamic law. And already they have a huge problem with whenever the default laws are always going to be Muslim. For example, if you have a Protestant Christian and a Coptic Christian who want a divorce, they have to do it under Islamic law. And unless one of them can convert, and there were so many insincere conversions, so that, maybe the Protestant trying to convert to the Coptic Church, that now it's quite difficult to convert if it seems like an insincere conversion. If you have two Copts, then they follow the Coptic rule. If you have two Protestants, they follow the rules. But under Shenouda, he reduced the divorce, the rationales for divorce down to basically just adultery. And this is another thing that the laity are very upset about, because previous to Shenouda, there had been many more reasons that you could divorce, but he reduced them to just mainly this one. I mean, you could probably get some other reasons involved there too, but it was Shenouda who really restricted divorce, and the laity would like Tawadros to expand it, because there are so many people, they say, that are in this limbo of not being able to divorce, but are separated or whatever.
I think we have time for one last question. Alex, please.
I'm Alex Shalaby.
As a product of the Presbyterian missionaries who went to Egypt, as you pointed out, in the mid-19th century, on my mother's side, I heard you numerous times talk about the Coptics and the Protestants. Protestants are Coptic Protestants.
Well, that's what they call
and you
them.
made that point, of course. But
Yes.
it seems to me, from some of your responses, as if the Copts are one thing and the Protestants are another. But
No.
they're not. I mean, the evangelical church is the Coptic
They
evangelical
all
church
came out
of
of
Egypt.
the Coptic church.
Yes, of course. No, definitely. In fact, one of my great grandfathers was the first Presbyterian minister in Egypt, Shenouda Hanna, and obviously he was Orthodox prior to that. So it converted, became not converted. It's the same religion, but I think I hear this quite often, as if the Copts are kind of a different religion. I mean, they're Christian, and they're Eastern Church Christians, and the Protestants, as you absolutely correctly pointed out, are very close, and they're Presbyterian. When you watch or on television, we watch a lot of the Kasur Dubara services, and it is like kind of the Baptist churches in the South, and even though it is a Presbyterian church. So yes, I mean there has been a transformation, but there has been a transformation here. As someone who's lived in this country almost half a century, and as an elder in the Presbyterian Church in California 30 years ago, and today here in the Washington area, there's a huge difference in what was and what is within the Presbyterian Church. Likewise in Egypt. So just so no one leaves with the notion, the idea that there are kind of the Christians of Egypt they follow different paths, but they're Copts.
No, you're right. And I guess the point I was trying to make was that when it seems beneficial, the Presbyterians or whatever origin church you came from in Egypt, when it's beneficial, you connect yourself with these foreign churches. Whereas when it's not beneficial, such as during the Nasser period, then you start calling yourself Coptic evangelical and make more of a thing of your indigenous aspect. But they all came basically from this Coptic origin. Is he allowed?
Okay, we'll squeeze in one last one. Your name, please?
Yes, I'm going to be very quick. My name is Mina Abdel Malak, and actually, Alex's comment encouraged me to made like one small comment.
Okay.
In the beginning, you made the statement that many Coptics, like historically speaking, welcomed the invader, the Arab invasion. Actually, this is not a Coptic narrative. This is kind of like the state and the Muslim narrative. Okay. That's why I know it's a small thing, but I just wanted to.
Yeah. Well, the history books claim that at first they were more receptive to the Muslim invaders because they were already suffering under these Christian rulers that looked down on them. There's so much more about all of this to say, and I feel I oversimplify in something like this. I'm not claiming, and there's so many also. For example, the Christians are known in Egypt for being the first to adopt education for their children, to get in these technical jobs, government jobs, everything. At the lower class, it's almost a reverse of that. they're the last ones to take advantage of opportunities. But theirs were the children that didn't go to the schools in Bulaq. We had a much higher rate of non-enrollment among the Christians because they're fearful for their children. I mean, you can generalize at all different levels and come up with different conclusions. And I just wanted to kind of develop a context in which you could look at how Christians at two levels certainly looked at them. And I can tell from your names that some of you are Copts, and that was slightly terrifying to think. You know much more than I do.
Well, the terror is over. I think Andrea acquitted herself fantastically, and it's a very interesting book. We do have a few copies left available for sale, which Andrea will stick around to sign. And thank you very much for your remarks today. Please join me in thanking Andrea.